It happened in 2016, late in October. I was 25 at the time and living in a shared flat in northern Scotland, not far from Inverness. I'd been there for about 6 months, working on a wind farm crew after I left my job in Glasgow. I needed the break from the city. The work was quiet, simple, and paid decently enough, especially for someone like me who didn't care much for pubs or going out. Most of the guys on the crew were fine, friendly, normal, but there was one guy, Callum, who liked pushing boundaries. He was a year or two younger than me, always talking about doing something nuts or mental, trying to rope people into dumb challenges. We worked together often, and though I didn't really like him, we got on well enough to tolerate each other on shifts. One Friday, we just finished a long day climbing turbines, and while driving back through a countryside road, we passed this collapsed stone wall. Behind it, all overgrown with brambles and nettles, sat a graveyard. It was an old one. No sign, no proper gate. The stones were crumbling and crooked, some half sunk into the soil. Trees had grown wild over everything, like the land had been forgotten. Callum laughed and said someone should camp in it. I gave a half shrug, not thinking much of it. But later that night, after we were back in the flat, it came up again. We were sitting around, just a few of us, Callum, me, and one of the older guys, Fraser, drinking cheap beer and watching a film. Out of nowhere, Callum brought it back up. He said he'd give £100 cash to anyone who'd spend a full night in the graveyard we saw. No leaving till dawn. No tents, just a sleeping bag and a headlamp. No phone either, just a flashlight and a sleeping bag. He was clear about that. I didn't want the money, but I've never liked being called scared or soft. So I agreed. The following day, I got ready. I packed light, just a rolled-up foam mat, a thick sleeping bag, some water, and a small LED torch I had from work. No phone, just like Callum said. He even checked my pockets before I left. He gave me a cheap wind-up watch to track the time. They dropped me off just after 6:30 p.m. Sunset came early that far north. The sky was already darkening, thick with clouds. It was meant to rain later, but I figured I could deal with that. I crossed the broken wall and walked through a narrow track lined with brambles and wet leaves until I found a flat space near a row of moss-covered graves. The whole area was about the size of a football pitch. There were no buildings, no chapel or church nearby, just trees, rough ground, and grave markers. Some didn't even have names left on them. A few were tilted like teeth growing in crooked. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy. No wind, just the distant drip of water from the trees and the occasional cry of a crow. The nearest house was about a mile down the road, and even that one looked empty. I laid out my mat and sleeping bag, trying not to think too hard. The torch cast a small, cold beam, and I kept it pointed low. The grave I camped beside had a name. Margaret Boyd, died 1882. The stone was cracked, but the writing was still visible. There were wild daisies around the base, and a thick vine growing across the top. I didn't feel anything strange, just the odd weight of being around so many graves in the dark. By 8 p.m., it was completely dark. No moon, just a flat, starless sky above the trees. I sat with my back against a stone, watching the minutes crawl by. The watch felt slower than usual. I ate half a cereal bar and washed it down with a few sips of water. Around 9, the wind picked up. Nothing bad, just a light breeze at first, but enough to rustle the trees and move the long grass. A few times I thought I saw shapes in the dark, but it was just the torchlight catching branches or tall weeds. My imagination was running wild, but I kept telling myself there was nothing there, just earth, stone, and sky. At around 10 p.m., I decided to try and sleep. I zipped into my bag, kept the torch near my chest, and lay still. The ground was uneven beneath the mat, with a slight rise under my left shoulder. I shifted around but couldn't get fully comfortable. My mind wouldn't settle. Every sound felt louder than it should have. a branch snapping, a fox screeching somewhere in the trees. I knew these sounds. They weren't strange, but in that place they felt wrong. Around 11, something made me sit up. It was faint, not a scream, not a shout, more like a dry shuffle, like someone walking across fallen leaves. Slowly, I froze, holding the torch, not turning it on. I waited. Maybe it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, closer. It wasn't fast or panicked. It was deliberate. Slow steps, a pause, then another. They weren't heavy like boots, more like someone in socks. I turned on the torch and pointed it toward the sound. Nothing, just the trees swaying and the damp grass. I turned the torch off again. It was worse having it on. It made the shadows dance too much. I sat still, straining to listen. The noise had stopped. A while passed, maybe 20 minutes, before it came again. This time behind me, same sound. The shuffle of movement, very faint. I turned quickly, but my torch beam showed nothing but stones and dark. I stood up and scanned the area, moving slowly with the torch. I didn't want to seem like I was panicking, but I was starting to feel the edges of something I hadn't felt in years. Real fear. Not the kind from horror films or dark alleys. Real fear. The kind that comes from the feeling that you're not alone and you don't know what's out there. I stayed standing, turning in a slow circle every now and then. Nothing came out of the dark. No movement, no sound. Around midnight, it started to drizzle. Light at first, just enough to make the air feel cold. I pulled the sleeping bag over my head and crouched low beside the stone. I kept the torch off to preserve the battery. The next thing that happened made my skin crawl. It was around 12:30, maybe 1 a.m. I don't know exactly. I was starting to lose track. The wind had died again, and everything was still. I was lying half inside the bag, torch still gripped in my hand, when I heard it, this soft, clicking sound. Not a branch, not an animal. It was too rhythmic, like two stones tapping together, spaced a few seconds apart. Click, click, click. I sat up slowly this time. I didn't turn the torch on. I just listened. Click, click, click. Then it stopped. A long pause. Then the sound of something brushing against one of the nearby grave markers. Not the wind, it was something heavier. A dull scrape, like skin or cloth against stone. I turned on the torch. I swept it across the stones. I caught something only for a split second. Movement. A figure maybe 10 meters away, slipping behind one of the thicker gravestones. It was fast. Too fast to get a clear look. I shouted. Not words, just a guttural noise I couldn't hold back, and backed away. I kept the torch pointed where I saw it. Nothing moved again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I stayed crouched, torch in hand, heart beating hard, eyes straining to see through the dark. The rain picked up around 3 a.m., and I was soaked through by 4. My fingers were stiff, and my breath came out in clouds. Every few minutes I thought I heard something. A footstep, a breath, a shuffle, but I never saw anything again. When the sky finally started to lighten, it was the best sight I'd ever seen. I waited until the light was strong enough to see more than a few feet ahead before I started packing up. My bag was damp, my legs numb, and my nerves frayed. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared to move through the gravestones, afraid something would lunge at me from behind one. But I made it to the broken wall. I climbed over it and stood on the wet roadside, watching my breath steam out in the cold air. They came to pick me up at 7:10, same as we agreed. Callum and Fraser were in the van, both smiling like idiots. I didn't say anything on the ride back. They asked how it was. I didn't answer. I showered for nearly an hour when I got home and sat in my room alone the rest of the day. The next week, I went back. I didn't tell anyone. I needed to prove to myself it wasn't real. I parked down the road and walked the long way around, entering the graveyard from the woods behind it. I waited until late afternoon so I could explore in daylight. There were no signs of anyone ever being there. No footprints, no trash, no broken branches. Nothing. But I did find something that made my stomach twist. Near the stone where I slept, Margaret Boyd's grave, someone had placed a flat river stone on the grass. It had a small crack through it, and on the inside edge, faint scrape marks, like it had been tapped against something. Over and over again. I didn't touch it. I just walked away. I moved out of the flat a few weeks later, took a job closer to Fort William, and didn't speak to Callum or Fraser again. I don't tell people this story. Not really. Most wouldn't believe me, or they'd say it was a fox or my imagination. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. And sometimes, even now, when the wind is still and the air feels heavy, I think about those footsteps. That slow clicking. That glimpse of someone, something, moving behind the stone. And I wonder if it saw me, too. It was late October 2016, just after my 34th birthday. I had taken a short break from work and decided to drive out to the Welsh countryside, just east of Brecon. I didn't have anything planned. I just wanted the quiet, the fresh air, and to get away from the flat I was renting in Manchester. I'd been feeling boxed in for months. Everything around me in the city felt cramped, noisy, and artificial. The idea of being far from everything, camping under the sky, and waking up with frost on the canvas felt more comforting than anything else I could think of. I'd found Red Ash Trail by complete accident a few years earlier when I'd taken a detour during a road trip. It wasn't a marked campsite or anything official, just an overgrown loop of a logging road with a few clearings that people sometimes used for wild camping. No phone signal, no sounds except for the wind or your own breath. That was the appeal. You had to walk about 20 minutes in from the car park, lugging your stuff through the trees, but it was worth it for the silence. That year, it had been an early frost. By the time I arrived, the bracken was mostly brown and brittle, and the trees, mainly pine with some birch, stood half bare. I got there just before sunset. The drive down had been slow, mostly because of the narrow lanes. I parked the car just off the side of the trailhead and began hauling my pack, tent, and sleeping gear into the woods. I chose the same spot I'd used before. It sat just beside a dry creek bed, with a natural rock shelf where I could prop things up. There were signs someone else had camped there recently. Burnt logs in the fire pit, an empty beer can half buried under some leaves. I cleared the mess, set up my tent, laid out my sleeping mat and bag, and gathered some wood for a small fire. By the time I had the fire going, the last of the light was fading behind the trees. The first night was normal. I sat there, eating a can of beans I'd warmed on the edge of the fire, drinking water from a steel flask, watching the flames shift. The cold crept in quick after sunset. I'd come prepared with thermal clothes, gloves, a proper coat. I camped in colder weather before. Once the fire died down, I climbed into the tent and zipped everything up tight. The only sound was the wind brushing through the trees and the occasional cracking of branches settling in the cold. I woke once around 3 a.m. or so, not to a sound, but to the feeling of being watched. That's hard to explain without sounding like you're making it up. But I've camped enough times to know what normal feels like and what doesn't. That night, it was like something outside the tent had stopped moving when I stirred, like it had been shifting in the undergrowth until I woke, and now it was holding still. I didn't hear footsteps, just silence. I stayed still for a long time. I kept my head inside the sleeping bag, listening. I wanted to think it was a fox or maybe a badger, but foxes don't stay still that long, and badgers are too clumsy to move that quietly. I eventually drifted back to sleep. Not deeply, just enough to get through the rest of the night. By morning, the feeling was gone. The light broke clean through the trees, and the chill was biting. I stepped outside the tent, stretched, pissed into the leaves, and got a small breakfast going. Coffee, jerky, a protein bar. I told myself I'd imagine the feeling, that I'd been half asleep and the quiet got to me. It was easy to write it off when the sun was shining through the mist and you could see every shadow. I stayed busy through the morning. I gathered more wood, hiked a bit up the ridge nearby, and found the view I remembered from years before. Wide valleys stretching off into the haze, trees thinning as the hills rose. I didn't see anyone else, not even a dog walker. I liked that. It was what I'd come for. The second night, though, that's when everything changed. It started just after dark. I had the fire going again, but I didn't feel like eating much. I was just sitting there, bundled up, staring into the flames, letting my mind go blank. I started hearing something, far off, faint. At first, I thought it was an owl, but the sound was wrong. Not rhythmic, not hooting. It was broken, like something trying to mimic a sound it didn't quite understand. There'd be silence, then a short sound, then silence again. Too long to be an animal, too short to be a person. It was coming from the direction of the dry creek bed, but a bit deeper into the trees. I kept still. I didn't want to get up and shine a light. I didn't want to attract anything. That sound came again, only now it was closer. It was like someone trying to repeat a sound they'd heard once before, but not quite managing it. Like a child learning to speak, but without the understanding of what the sounds meant. My gut twisted. The hairs on my arms stood straight. I couldn't explain it, but I suddenly felt very small and very visible. Then I smelled something. It was sharp, not rot, not sewage. Something in between. Like blood and wet dog fur and rusted metal all rolled into one. Came and went on the wind. I froze, trying to figure out if it was coming from behind me or from the trees. My ears strained to pick up any hint of movement. That's when I saw it. First, it was just a shape, about 10 feet back in the tree lean, just beyond the firelight, standing upright, not moving. I thought it was a tree stump or a boulder or some strange illusion caused by the flickering flames. But then it shifted. Not a step, just a movement of weight. The kind a person makes when they're standing still for too long. A slight rock of the torso. It had arms, long arms. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stared. The figure didn't move closer. It just stayed there, watching. And then, without warning, it crouched. That movement, that crouch, was not natural, not human. It was too fast, too low. Its knees bent out at the wrong angle, like an animal folding down rather than a person. It was still watching, still holding still. I slowly reached behind me for my flashlight, not taking my eyes off the tree lean. I clicked it on and pointed it straight toward the shape. There was nothing there. No animal. No person, no tree stump. The ground was uneven, sloped slightly downward into the brush. But there was no figure. My heart was pounding in my chest. I scanned back and forth, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I stood, turned full circle, light sweeping across the trees. Still nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire until it died down to embers, then moved inside the tent and zipped everything shut again. I kept the flashlight in my hand. I stayed half awake the whole time, listening for any kind of movement. Around 2:30 a.m., I heard footsteps. Not animal, not scurrying or pawing. These were slow, deliberate. 2 feet, one step, then a pause, then another step, like someone walking barefoot over cold ground. They circled the tent once, maybe twice. Couldn't breathe. I lay there completely still, every muscle in my body locked. Then the smell returned. It wasn't just strong, it was thick, like it was clinging to the walls of the tent. That mix of rot and rust. My throat tightened. I wanted to gag. The smell got stronger near the side of the tent where my head was. Then came the sound of something touching the fabric. Lightly, press, then a scrape, like fingertips, then silence. Nothing moved after that. No wind, no breathing, just silence so deep it rang in my ears. I didn't come out of the tent until sunrise. When I finally stepped outside, everything looked normal, except for the marks in the dirt. About 3 feet from the tent, the grass had been disturbed. There were prints, not shoe prints, not boot treads, just indentations. Long, thin, almost like bare feet but with toes that spread too wide. Some of the grass was matted down, like something had been crouching low to the ground, waiting. I packed everything up that morning. No breakfast, no second thoughts. I crammed the tent into its sack, stuffed my gear into my pack, and started walking toward the car. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I walked faster than I probably should have, and when I got to the car, I drove without even checking the rearview mirror until I hit the main road. I didn't talk about it for months. I couldn't figure out how. How do you explain seeing something that didn't move like a person, didn't smell like an animal, didn't leave the kind of tracks you're used to? I wasn't drunk. I wasn't high. I wasn't tired enough to hallucinate. I know what I saw and I know what I felt. Something out there was watching me, and it was smart. It knew how to stay just out of reach, how to mess with your head. I've never gone back to Red Ash Trail. Not once, not even to drive by. Sometimes I wonder if I imagine the whole thing. But then I remember the smell, the way it mimicked a sound, the feeling of being circled in the dark. Those things aren't easy to make up. And I still have the sleeping bag packed away in storage. Still smells faintly like blood and rust. I've thought about burning it more than once. I was 34 that year. My name's Aaron, and I had just started taking solo camping more seriously. I wasn't new to the outdoors. My dad used to take me and my brother out when we were kids. But back then it was mostly state parks and RVs. Now that I was older, I wanted quiet. Real quiet. No people, no hookups, no marked trails with restroom signs every mile. I wanted that kind of peace that made the woods hum in your ears. It was late September of 2019. The kind of time when the trees start to go gold in the upper Midwest, when the air changes just enough to make your nose feel cold at night, but the days are still warm enough to hike in a t-shirt. I picked a spot in North Dakota, not far from the Montana border. There's a little stretch of wilderness west of Bowman that barely shows up on most travel guides. Locals call it Dakota Butte. It's not an official forest, not private land either. It's this in-between place that's half rock, half scrubby trees, and entirely empty. I found it by accident, scrolling forums where people share GPS pins of good, quiet places. Some guy posted a pin, said it was pretty empty, nice views, good for solitude. That was all I needed. I punched it into my GPS and started planning. I took a week off work, loaded my old green Tacoma with supplies, and left from Rapid City early Monday morning. Took me a little over 5 hours to get near the site. The last hour was just gravel roads and cattle gates. Not a single car passed me. By the time I arrived, the sun was leaning west. The sky was clear. I got out, stretched my legs, and looked around. Flat land gave way to low ridges. The buttes stood up from the prairie like the backs of sleeping animals. There were trees, more than I expected, but not like a dense forest. Mostly they were cottonwoods and chokecherries scattered in dips between the rises. There wasn't a sound. No traffic, no distant houses. I stood there for a while, listening. It was peaceful. Exactly what I came for. I didn't bother setting up the tent that first evening. I had one of those roll-up canvas cots and a bivy sack. I wanted to sleep under the stars. I unpacked slow, made some dehydrated chili with hot water from the jet boil, and watched the last pink light fade out of the sky. I should say now I didn't bring a gun. It's something I always go back and forth on. Most of the time, I figure I'm more likely to accidentally shoot myself than get into a situation where I need it. I had a knife, bear spray, and a small axe. That seemed like enough. The first night was uneventful. Some coyotes howled in the distance, but they didn't come close. I slept hard, woke early. That morning I hiked northeast, followed the dips and small ravines between the buttes, found a flat-topped one and climbed up. The view was amazing. You could see for miles, just empty scrub, distant ridges, and haze on the horizon. That afternoon I saw the truck. It was maybe half a mile out, parked near the edge of a butte. It was hard to see clearly, but it looked older, square frame, brown or dark green. It hadn't been there when I arrived. I watched it for a while, but I didn't see anyone moving around. No smoke, no sign of a camp. I didn't think much of it. Plenty of people drive out to weird places to hunt or just sit. Still, I marked it on my GPS and made sure I hiked back the long way, giving it distance. That night, the wind picked up. I slept inside the tent, staked it deep because the gusts rattled the fabric all evening. I didn't sleep as well. Some part of me kept listening. I didn't hear anything unnatural, just wind moving through the grass and the occasional crack of branches. The second full day, I stayed closer to camp, did some journaling, made a small fire, gathered deadfall from the nearby cottonwoods. Around 3 in the afternoon, I saw tire tracks. I hadn't noticed them when I arrived. They weren't fresh, maybe a few days old, but they cut across the dry dirt near where I parked my truck, went south past the camp, and then veered east. I followed them for maybe 40 yards before they disappeared into rock. It bothered me, but not for any specific reason. I just had this odd feeling like whoever made them wasn't out here for fun. There were no footprints, no trash, no shell casings, no beer cans, none of the usual things people leave behind. That evening, I went to bed early. No fire, just crawled into the sleeping bag and zipped up the tent. I left the rain fly off so I could see the stars. I was drifting when I heard something. At first, it was faint. A dull knock, then another. I opened my eyes. Came again. Knock, knock. Steady, deliberate. It wasn't wind. Sounded like wood, like someone tapping a stick against a tree. I sat up, heart pounding. The knocking stopped. I waited. 10 minutes passed. Then I heard something crunch. Dry grass or leaves. Close. Too close. I stayed completely still, breathing through my nose. My hand found the bear spray. I clicked the safety off. Another step. Then nothing. I stayed like that for almost an hour, listening to every sound. Eventually, I convinced myself it might have been a deer or even wind knocking a branch against a trunk. But I didn't sleep. When the sky lightened, I got up, packed everything, and moved camp. I didn't go far, just about a mile west into a little cut below a slope. It was tighter, less open, but I felt better being out of sight. That morning I scouted the area, made sure I wasn't on any animal trail. I didn't find anything, no prints, no weird signs, no trash. I set up the tent again, gathered more wood, tried to shake off the nerves. That afternoon, I saw the truck again. This time it was closer, parked near the edge of a ridge maybe a quarter mile from me. Same shape, same dull color. I crouched low, watched it for a long time. Still no movement. No one came out.
No noise.
No binocular flash, no drone hum, no sound of a door. Eventually the light started to fade, and I forced myself to look away. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept the bear spray and the axe inside the tent. My boots stayed on. I laid in the sleeping bag but never zipped it. Every small sound made my heart jump. Sometime past midnight, I heard the knocking again. Closer this time. 3 knocks, then quiet, then a single knock, like it had moved position, then crunching, slow, steady steps. I held the axe tight, trying not to breathe. The bear spray sat next to my chest. I didn't move. Whatever it was came within 10 feet of the tent, then stopped.
No breathing, no cough, no sniff.
Just silence. It stood there for what felt like a full minute. Then I heard steps moving away. Not fast, just gone. To first light, I came out of the tent. I walked a circle around the area. There were no prints. The ground was hard, dry, but I could tell some grass had been stepped on, flattened. It wasn't a deer. The steps had weight. I could feel it in my chest when they moved near. I thought about leaving, packing up and heading straight for the road. But I felt stupid. No one had done anything. Nothing was missing. There was no threat, just fear. I stayed one more night. Big mistake. I moved the tent again, higher ground, back near the butte's edge, where I could see more. I didn't cook that night. Ate jerky and trail mix. No fire. I stayed outside the tent, sitting on a rock, watching the hills. The stars came out. The wind picked up. I saw movement, just at the edge of the ridge. A shape.
Manshapit.
Tall. Still. It stood there for a long time. Not walking. Not crouching. Just watching. I didn't have binoculars. My headlamp was off. I just sat still, eyes wide, watching it back. Eventually, it crouched. Not a fast movement. Not a casual one either. It bent at the knees, hands out, and slowly dropped lower into the grass. I lost sight of it. I waited, nearly an hour. Then I heard the knocking. Not behind me, below. Then another knock to the left. Then another. 3 separate places. I stood up slow, backed toward the tent, never turning my back. I didn't sleep. I didn't even lie down. I just sat with my back against a boulder, axe in my hand, bear spray on my lap. When morning came, I packed everything in 15 minutes. As I drove out, I passed a set of fresh tire tracks that hadn't been there when I arrived. They weren't mine. I got back to Bowman around noon, drove straight to a gas station, sat in the lot for half an hour just breathing. I didn't tell anyone. What would I say? Back at home, I looked up news reports. Nothing strange. No missing persons, no manhunt, no murders. I scrolled forums, tried to find that post with the GPS pin. It was gone. To this day, I don't know what I saw, but I'll never camp alone again. And if I ever do, it won't be in North Dakota. I was 29 when I decided to take a week off from work and drive out to the Lake District in England. It was late October 2019, just before everything started to get cold enough to cancel any ideas of sleeping outside. I had no family in the area, didn't tell anyone where I was going, and didn't have any reason for the trip other than I needed time to be completely alone. I was burned out. Work had taken more out of me than I realized, and I figured a few days in a tent with no emails, no traffic, and no pressure would help me get my mind back in order. The first couple of days were uneventful. I parked my car at a long-stay spot just outside of Keswick, loaded up my gear, and hiked north into the deeper parts of the forest where tourists didn't usually go. I found a stretch of old forest beside a dried-up creek bed and decided it was good enough to set up base. My tent was small, just enough for one, and I had everything I needed. Stove, water purifier, enough dry food to last 5 days, and a small solar charger for emergencies. I didn't plan on using my phone much. I just wanted to sleep, cook, maybe hike during the day, and then just exist. For the first 2 nights, everything went fine. I had a small fire going in the evenings, listened to the wind in the trees, and tried to enjoy the calm. It rained the second night, but I'd set my tent on high ground and dug shallow trenches around it to keep the runoff away. My tent stayed dry. I woke up a few times from the rain hitting the top, but nothing strange, just normal wilderness stuff. I remember thinking it was exactly what I needed, but things changed on the third night. That day, I decided to walk further north, toward some hills I saw on the map. I left around noon, packed light, and hiked for a few hours. The forest got denser up there, and I didn't see any signs of other people. No old fire pits, no rubbish, no flattened grass where someone had slept before. It felt untouched. I liked that at first. As I was heading back toward my camp, maybe 2 hours before sunset, I started hearing something that didn't quite fit. It sounded like branches breaking. Not the normal creaking of trees in the wind, but sudden cracks, like something heavy moving through the undergrowth. At first, I thought it might be a deer or maybe even a boar. They aren't too common there, but I'd heard of sightings. I stopped and crouched down, trying to get a glimpse through the trees. The sound was ahead and slightly to the left, maybe 30 or 40 meters off the trail. It stopped after about 10 seconds. Just silence. I waited for another minute, but nothing moved again. I told myself it was just a deer and kept walking. But after that, I noticed something strange. There were no birds. All day, I'd heard the usual high-pitched chirping, especially in the morning. But now, even though the sun hadn't set yet, it was quiet. Not dead quiet, but strangely dull. Just wind. That's the kind of thing you notice in the woods when you've been there a while. The normal background noise disappears and it puts your nerves on edge. Your brain starts trying to figure out why everything else has gone quiet. By the time I made it back to camp, it was nearly dark. I boiled some water for pasta, kept the fire going low, and tried to shake the weird feeling. I didn't hear anything else that evening, but I kept turning around every few minutes like something might be behind me. Just nerves, I figured. Probably just that sound earlier. I forced myself to sit still, eat, and then get into my tent. I zipped it up fully and kept the flashlight near my hand. That night, I didn't sleep well. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up needing to pee. I unzipped the tent just enough to slide out and walked maybe 10 feet from the entrance. It was cold, and my breath came out thick in the air. There was no wind, no noise. I could hear my boots crunching on the wet leaves as I moved. I did what I needed to do, then turned around to get back in the tent. That's when I noticed it. Something had moved. The small pile of sticks I'd left near the edge of camp for the fire was scattered. I hadn't heard anything, but the pile wasn't where it had been. It wasn't a big change, just slightly off to the side, like someone had walked through it carelessly. I stood there staring at it for maybe a minute, trying to decide if I was just remembering it wrong. I'm usually careful about how I stack my wood. I didn't remember it being like that. I backed into the tent and zipped it all the way up again. I didn't sleep after that. I just lay there, fully dressed, not even in my sleeping bag, listening. Around 4 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps, not animal sounds. These were slow, heavy steps, one at a time. Crunch, pause, crunch, then a stop. They circled the tent. It was hard to tell how far away. Maybe 5 or 6 meters, maybe closer, but the sound was clear. A foot on wet leaves, then silence, then again on the other side. I didn't move. I didn't breathe loudly. I didn't even reach for my flashlight. I just stayed still, hoping whatever it was would lose interest and go away. Didn't. It stopped moving for a long time. I started to think maybe it was gone. Then something brushed the side of the tent. Not hard, just enough to make the nylon ripple slightly. I clenched my fists and kept still. My heart was pounding in my ears, louder than the wind outside. I don't know how long it stayed there. Could have been 5 minutes. Could have been 30. Eventually, the sounds stopped. Whatever it was, it left. I waited until the sky started to get light before I moved. When the sun came up, I stepped outside. Nothing was missing, but I could see the prints in the mud around the edge of the tent. They weren't boots. They were bare feet. Long, narrow prints with deep heels and wide toes.
No shoes, no socks.
Just human feet, out there in the cold, in the middle of nowhere. I packed up everything in 15 minutes. Didn't even make breakfast. I headed straight south, toward the road. I didn't follow the same path I came up from. I cut straight through the woods, trusting my compass and praying my legs wouldn't give out. I only stopped once to drink from the stream. I reached the road by noon and hiked down until I found a small shop with a payphone. I didn't even have signal. I called a taxi to take me back to Keswick and booked a room for the night. I didn't go home right away. I didn't even tell anyone what happened. I just sat in that room, showered 3 times, and stared at the wall. 2 weeks later, I read an article online about a missing hiker. Same area, different direction, but not far from where I'd been. They never found him. I haven't gone camping since. Not alone, not even in a group. I bought a camera, installed deadbolts, and started keeping a log of anything that feels strange around my apartment. Sometimes at night, when it rains, I still hear footsteps. But the one thing I can't explain, the thing that keeps me awake even now, is how clean those footprints were. No mud dragged in.
No smears.
No other marks. Like they hadn't walked there. Like they were placed. That's what stays with me. That, and the fact that I didn't hear a single sound when they left. It was late September of 2019 when I decided to take a solo camping trip. I was 31 back then, working a dead-end delivery job in Coventry, England. Life had started to blur into the same routine: wake up, work, eat, sleep, repeat. I hadn't taken a real break in years, and I figured a few days out in nature might clear my head a bit. I wasn't chasing anything spiritual or deep. I just wanted to sit away from people for a while and maybe hear nothing but rain or birds for once. I picked a spot in the Peak District, not far from a small village called Wetton. I'd seen the place once years ago when my cousin dragged me on a hike there. It stuck in my mind because of how quiet it was. Just long fields, thick woods, and the kind of winding lanes that make you feel like you've gone back in time. I didn't book a campsite or anything fancy. Just packed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, a few tins of beans, and one of those foldable stoves, and drove up there in my old hatchback. The day I left, it was already raining, that fine English drizzle that never seems to end. The forecast had said it'd clear by evening, so I wasn't too bothered. I drove with the windows cracked, rain misting through, damp air filling the car. It was calming in a weird way. Took me about 3.5 hours to get to the edge of the woodland I was aiming for. There was a gravel lay-by next to an old stone wall, just big enough for one car. That was where I parked. The rain picked up as I got my stuff out. I wore a thick hoodie and an old waterproof jacket, but it wasn't doing much by the time I got my backpack slung on. I left the car locked behind me and followed a narrow, overgrown path that led into the woods. The trees were dense and the canopy above did little to stop the rain. It was all brown leaves, dripping branches, and mud, but it was quiet, peaceful even. That's what I wanted. I walked for about 25 minutes, boots sinking slightly with every step, until I found a dryish patch under a thick oak tree. The rain wasn't hitting the ground as much there. I set the tent up fast, getting soaked in the process. It was a simple dome tent, nothing fancy, but it kept the rain off. Once I got inside and zipped everything shut, I felt oddly proud. It was cold, wet, and miserable, but I was alone, and for once, no one was asking anything from me. I changed into dry clothes, lit a little candle lamp, and set it in the corner of the tent. The sound of the rain on the canvas was constant. I could hear the distant sound of wind brushing against branches, and somewhere far off, the low moan of cows or maybe sheep. I made a quick dinner, beans and some bread, and sat cross-legged inside the tent, eating straight from the tin. It was cramped, but it felt good to not be in a flat or stuck in traffic for once. Night came quicker than I expected. By 7:30, it was nearly pitch black outside. The rain hadn't let up. If anything, it got heavier. You could hear it slapping against the leaves and splashing into the undergrowth. My phone had no signal, which I expected. I checked the battery 70%, then turned it off to save power. There was no point in scrolling through anything anyway. I lay down in my sleeping bag and listened to the storm. It was the kind of steady noise that should lull you to sleep, but something kept me from fully relaxing. It wasn't fear or nerves. Not yet. It was more like a dull tension in my chest, like I was forgetting something important. It started around 10 p.m. I dozed off a little, but then I heard what sounded like movement outside. Not the wind, not the rain, something deliberate, something heavier. It came from about 20 feet away, maybe behind the oak tree I'd set up under. It was the sound of something stepping on wet leaves, then a faint rustle, then nothing. I froze. The rain kept going, but I strained my ears beneath it, trying to separate the noises. Could have been an animal. Fox, maybe a deer. They're common in that area, and I'd even packed my camera hoping I might spot one. But I didn't hear it again for a while, just the rain and wind. I lay back down, eyes wide open, heart beating a little faster now. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep again because when I opened my eyes next, it was well past midnight. I knew it was late because the candle lamp had burned out and the inside of the tent was pitch black. The rain was louder than ever. It was coming down in sheets now, hammering the tent walls and dripping down the seams. I felt damp. My sleeping bag was cold against my skin, and I could feel the wetness soaking through underneath. I reached for my phone and checked the time. It was 2:14 a.m., and then I heard it again. Movement. This time closer, much closer. It wasn't just a single step, it was slow, uneven steps, like someone trying to walk quietly but not quite managing it. My heart started to hammer in my chest. I didn't breathe. I didn't even blink. It was just outside the tent now, just on the other side of the thin, rain-soaked nylon. Whatever it was, it stopped right near my head. I could hear water dripping off of it, like it had been out in the storm for a long time. I could hear the faint sound of wet fabric, like a soaked jacket brushing against itself. I thought maybe it was another hiker, someone caught in the storm, stumbling across my tent by accident. But they didn't call out. They didn't knock. They didn't do anything but stand there. I could hear them breathing, not loud, but sharp and uneven, like they were catching their breath. My brain raced with possibilities. Poacher, maybe? A lost local? Someone drunk from the village? But why just stand there? I reached slowly into my bag for the small knife I'd packed for cooking. It wasn't much, a little folding thing I used to open tins, but it was all I had. I held it tight, not daring to move otherwise. Then, slowly, the person, or whatever it was, started to walk again. Around the tent. Clockwise, I followed the sound in my head. One slow step at a time. It circled halfway around, paused, then moved the other direction. At that point, I felt real fear start to crawl up my spine. Something wasn't right. Nobody normal acts like that. Nobody walks silently around someone's tent in the middle of the night, in the pouring rain, without saying a word. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The steps stopped again, this time near the front of the tent, where the zipper was. I looked at the flap. The only thing separating me from whatever was out there was that thin line of fabric. Then, slowly, the zipper started to move. Just a little. It moved about 3 inches down, then stopped. I gripped the knife harder. I didn't want to make a sound, but I was ready to stab through the tent wall if I had to. My heart was thudding so hard I thought it might give me away. And then, just like that, the zipper went back up. All the way. I waited. Minutes passed. I heard nothing. No steps.
No breathing.
Nothing but the rain and the occasional groan of trees bending in the wind. Eventually, I moved. I unzipped the sleeping bag, turned on my phone's flashlight, and shone it around the tent interior. Nothing was torn. Nothing was touched. I slowly unzipped the front of the tent just an inch and peeked out. Nothing. Just darkness, falling rain, and the thick shadows of the woods. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat up, knife in hand, light on, until the sun started to rise. The storm hadn't stopped, but the light brought some comfort. By 6 a.m., I was already packing up. Everything was soaked. My boots squelched with every step, and my backpack felt twice as heavy with all the wet gear inside. I didn't care. I just wanted out. I followed the same path back to the lay-by, eyes scanning every tree, every movement. When I got back to the car, I dumped everything in the back and locked the doors behind me. I sat there in the front seat for a long time, heater on, windows fogging up. I didn't drive for almost half an hour. I just stared at the tree line, and then I saw something that made my stomach turn. About 20 feet down from where I'd parked, just off the gravel, were footprints. Deep ones.
Bootprints.
Not mine. They came out of the woods, walked a few steps toward the lay-by, then vanished. Not back into the trees. Just gone. Like the person who made them had stood there, watching, then walked off into the road. But I hadn't seen anyone. Not on the road, not while packing, not the entire way back. I drove home in silence. Didn't even turn on the radio. I didn't tell anyone about it for weeks. When I finally did, I left out most of the details. Just said I heard something weird and decided to cut the trip short. But the part that stuck with me, the part one still think about even now, is how long they stood there, outside the tent, just listening, just breathing. They never tried to talk to me, never shined a light, never walked away with any rush. They weren't scared or confused. They were just waiting, and I still don't know what for. I was 32 years old when I made one of the worst decisions of my life. It was mid-October of 2018. The nights were starting to get cold, but I had been looking forward to a solo camping trip for months. I had just left a job that drained the life out of me, and before starting my new one, I wanted a few days to clear my head. No phones, no people, no noise, just trees, cold air, and quiet. I lived in Gloucestershire at the time, near the Forest of Dean. Most campers and hikers stick to the trails there, the popular forest walks. But I had heard about a disused quarry somewhere east of Colford. It hadn't been active in decades, and people said it was hidden off old forestry roads that no one used anymore. The idea of being that far from everything pulled me in. I didn't tell anyone where I was going because I didn't think I had to. I told a mate I'd be out in the forest, but I didn't name the quarry or give coordinates. The drive took less than 2 hours. I parked the car behind a bramble patch on the side of a narrow dirt track and started walking with my gear. It took me about 40 minutes to reach the edge of the quarry. The place was deeper than I expected, an uneven bowl with cliffs and ledges along the perimeter. Trees leaned over the edge in places, their roots exposed in midair. The bottom was littered with old stone chunks, piles of gravel, and rusted debris. One side looked climbable, a sloped path that led to a narrow floor below. That's where I set up camp. The first day was quiet. No wind, just a few birds. I walked around the rim of the quarry for a while before heading back to cook a simple meal by my small fire. I had a second-hand military tarp strung between 2 rocks and a sleeping bag I trusted. I remember feeling completely alone in the best way possible. The cold set in early, and I crawled into my sleeping bag by 8. That first night, I heard something. Around 1 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of small rocks falling somewhere above me. It wasn't loud, just the clatter of gravel shifting on one of the ledges. I figured it was an animal, maybe a fox or a badger. I remember waiting in the darkness, completely still, expecting to hear more. But it stopped. After maybe a minute, silence returned. The next morning, I hiked up to where I thought the noise came from. I didn't find any tracks or anything unusual, but something felt off. Not in a big, obvious way, just a small, uncomfortable awareness, like I wasn't as alone as I had thought. Still, I shrugged it off and went about my day. I explored more of the quarry floor, climbed up a few narrow ridges, took photos. There were old rusted cables and iron bars twisted in piles, probably left from whatever machinery had been there long ago. In one spot near a stone overhang, I found a small cave entrance, barely wide enough for me to crawl through. I didn't go inside. I didn't even get close to it. Something about the shape of it, the blackness inside, made me keep my distance. That evening, I cooked again, same routine. By now, I'd started to notice how little animal life there was down there. I hadn't seen squirrels, rabbits, nothing. No sounds either, just the wind. It was strange, but I told myself it was probably just the location. Maybe animals avoided the quarry. That night, it got worse. Around 2 in the morning, I was woken again. This time, it was footsteps, not far off. Slow, heavy steps across the gravel floor. I lay frozen in my bag, eyes wide open, my breath shallow. I couldn't see anything. My tarp was low and closed on all sides. I didn't move. The steps went on for maybe 20 seconds, then stopped. I waited. Nothing, not even the wind. After what felt like an hour, I reached quietly for my flashlight, flicked it on, and shined it through the gap in my tarp. Nothing. No movement, no sound. But I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I walked every inch of the quarry floor. I found a few indentations in the gravel, but they were so unclear that I couldn't say for sure what made them. They weren't boot prints, not really. They looked shallow, round, more like the pressure of something heavy without a defined shape. I told myself it was paranoia, that I was tired, that sleep deprivation can do funny things. Still, something in me didn't want to stay another night. I packed slowly, dragging it out. But the idea of walking back through the woods so late in the day made me hesitate. I kept thinking, just one more night, then leave early in the morning. That evening, I decided not to cook. I just ate some cold snacks, zipped up the tarp early, and lay in my bag with my flashlight next to me, still dressed. I don't know if I expected anything. I just wanted the night to pass. Didn't. It was close to midnight when I heard something new. A strange scraping sound. Not metal, not rocks, like something dull being dragged across stone. It came from the cave entrance I'd found earlier that day. The sound started and stopped, then started again. I sat up quietly, not daring to breathe too loudly. The sound continued for maybe 5 minutes, then silence, then footsteps again. But these weren't random. They were circling my tent. Slow. One step. Pause. Another. They went around me once. Then again. Then silence. I didn't move. Not for hours. At some point, I must have passed out from exhaustion. When I woke up, the sky was pale gray. I sat up quickly, checked my gear. Everything was there. Nothing disturbed. But outside my tarp, there were marks. Not footprints, just shallow trails in the gravel. Circles, random loops, like someone had dragged a stick in the dirt, except no stick. I packed in 20 minutes. I didn't eat, didn't drink. I just shoved everything into my bag and climbed the slope back to the rim. The trail back to my car felt longer than I remembered. I kept stopping, listening. Nothing followed. But the silence was so complete it felt unnatural. I made it to my car by mid-morning. When I stepped onto the dirt road, I saw something that made me freeze. There were 2 deep gouges in the ground behind my car. Long, narrow tracks, maybe a foot apart. They went from the tree line straight to the back of my car and stopped. I checked the vehicle. No damage.
No tampering.
Just those marks. Like someone or something had dragged 2 poles or legs behind it, walking right up to the vehicle sometime during the night. I drove out of there fast. I didn't stop until I hit the main road near Cinderford. Back home, I didn't tell anyone. I didn't sleep properly for a week. My new job started the following Monday. I tried to put it out of my mind. Tried to forget the quarry, the cave, the marks in the gravel. But the worst part came 3 weeks later. I was at home, sorting through photos on my camera from the trip. Most were trees, rocks, sky. But then I saw a picture I didn't remember taking. It was from the second night, time-stamped around 2:11 a.m., about the time I heard those footsteps. The photo showed the quarry, dimly lit, probably from the moon. My tarp was visible in the corner, and behind it, maybe 15 feet away, something was standing upright. It wasn't clear. It was blurry, like it moved during the shot. But it was tall, much taller than a person. Thin arms, too long. No visible face. It looked bent, like it didn't fit its own shape. I deleted it immediately. I've never gone camping alone again. I've never gone back to the Forest of Dean at all. And I never told anyone what I saw in that photo. But I know now why there were no animals down there. I know now why that quarry was abandoned. And I know that some places are empty for a reason. I was 32 when I decided to take a short camping trip in the northern countryside of England. I'd just come off a hard stretch of working night shifts in Manchester. The hours had taken a toll on me, and I felt more disconnected from the world than I had in years. I was tired all the time, my sleep pattern was completely messed up, and every little thing annoyed me. It had gotten to the point where I barely recognized myself. So when my rota opened up for a week in late September, I packed my gear and drove north. I wanted to get away from people, cars, computers, everything. No phone signal, no Wi-Fi, just quiet air and thick trees. I picked Thornley Forest. It was outside a small village called Millersford, near the Yorkshire Dales. The forest itself wasn't well known. It wasn't one of those big hiking destinations. Just a thick spread of old woods, a few overgrown trails, and long, sloping ridges. I found a forum post about it from a guy who said he used to camp there as a teenager. He described it as silent, rough, and a little spooky. That was exactly what I wanted. I arrived mid-afternoon on a Wednesday. It was cloudy but not cold. The forest sat just behind a long, uneven stone wall with patches of moss covering most of it. There was a narrow footpath beside a farmer's field, and I followed that until it dipped into the treeline. My plan was to hike in about 2 miles, find a flat spot away from the path, and spend 2 nights. I had a one-man tent, food for 3 days, a small stove, and a cheap camo rain cover for the tent. I'd left a note with my sister saying where I'd gone. Not that she would have cared. We weren't that close anymore. By 5, I'd found a good spot. It was tucked away behind a small hill, not too far from a slow-running stream. The ground was soft but not wet. There were no signs of recent campers. Felt like no one had been through there in a long time. I set up camp and boiled a bit of water for tea. That first night was calm. The wind in the trees was steady but soft, and the forest was quieter than I'd expected. No traffic sounds.
No voices.
I slept early, sometime around 9. It was that next morning when things started to feel wrong. I woke up to a strange pattern in the ground near my tent. I hadn't noticed it when I arrived. It looked like shallow footprints, but they weren't deep enough to say for sure. It was like something had pressed into the ground lightly, just enough to disturb the surface. The pattern circled the side of my tent and ended near the edge of the trees. I stared at it for a while, thinking maybe it was mine from the day before, but they didn't line up with my boot size. These were smaller. Not child small, but smaller than mine. Narrow, with a pointed heel and shallow toe marks. I told myself it could have been a deer or a dog, or maybe just natural settling. I didn't want to get worked up over it. I made breakfast and decided to walk farther into the forest that day. By the time I got back around 5 in the afternoon, I saw more of the same marks, this time near my stove and food pack. Again, shallow and light, like someone had stepped carefully. I felt a sharp unease in my stomach, but I ignored it. I told myself it was probably just foxes. I packed the food tighter, brought it into the tent with me, and zipped everything up. That night, I didn't sleep as well. The wind had picked up, and the trees creaked and groaned above me. At some point, maybe around midnight, I thought I heard movement outside. Not fast, just slow, careful steps through leaves. I stayed completely still and held my breath. The sound faded after a while. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't want to see anything. The next morning, I forced myself to be logical. I told myself it was probably a badger or a fox. They're curious. The wind might have made things sound closer than they were. But still, I packed up early. I decided I'd hike to a new spot, farther into the forest. Somewhere deeper where I could feel more secure, even if that made no real difference. I hiked about 45 minutes north along a barely visible animal trail. I found a small flat area surrounded by thick growth. It was hard to see in or out from where I pitched the tent. That made me feel better, but that comfort didn't last long. Around 6 in the evening, while I was eating, I noticed something that didn't sit right. About 30 meters away, partially hidden behind a cluster of birch trees, there was a figure. He was standing completely still. He wasn't close enough for me to see his face, but I could make out his outline between the trees. He wore dark clothes, maybe a jacket or a heavy coat, and he stood with his arms low, just hanging, not moving at all. I froze. My food slipped off the fork in my hand and landed in the dirt. I didn't know what to do. I stared at him, trying to make sense of it. Then he stepped sideways, slowly, almost casually, and disappeared behind one of the trunks. I didn't move. I waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Nothing. I didn't go looking. I didn't want to. I pulled everything into my tent, zipped it up, and sat there with my pocket knife in my hand. That was all I had. No gun, no phone signal, just a 4-inch blade and a thin tent wall between me and whatever or whoever that was. I didn't sleep. At some point deep into the night, I heard movement again. This time it wasn't leaves. It was breathing. I could hear someone breathing near my tent. Shallow, almost slow on purpose. Then something brushed the side of the tent. Just lightly, like a hand. I stayed still for over an hour, afraid to even blink. The breathing stopped eventually. The noise faded. When daylight came, I stepped out and looked around. Nothing was there, but the same shallow prints were scattered all around the tent. They weren't new anymore. They were old, layered. This wasn't the first time he'd come close. I should have packed up right then, but I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe I felt frozen, like leaving might mean turning my back, like staying put was safer. I told myself he was just some local, maybe a weirdo from the village, someone who liked messing with campers. I stayed through that day, nervous the entire time. At dusk, I set up my flashlight on a branch to give myself a wider range of vision. I didn't eat. I didn't boil water. I just sat. When darkness came, I didn't see anything for hours. But around 1 in the morning, I spotted movement. Not far from the tree line, this time closer than before, he stepped out again. He was taller than I'd thought. Lanky, shoulders hunched. His face looked pale in the moonlight, and I realized he wasn't wearing a proper jacket. It looked like an old trench coat, stained and heavy. He had something in his hand, long and thin. Could have been a stick, could have been something worse. He didn't move toward me. He just stood there, maybe 15 meters away. I didn't say a word. I didn't move. I just stared back, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. He stood there for over 5 minutes. Then he stepped back and vanished again into the woods. That was it. I snapped. I waited for the sun to come up, packed everything in under 15 minutes, and left without breakfast. I didn't follow any trail. I just moved in a straight line back the direction I thought the stone wall was. I didn't care if I got lost. I just needed to get out. Took me 2 hours to find the car. I threw everything in the boot and drove straight back to Manchester. I didn't tell anyone for weeks. I didn't sleep properly for longer than that. A month later, curiosity got the better of me. I called a shop in Millersford just to ask if anyone had reported strange people in Thornley Forest. The man who picked up told me something that stuck in my head. He said the forest had a history, not criminal, just odd. Local teens avoided it. People said there was an old hermit who used to live out there years ago, maybe still did. No one knew where. No one ever saw him up close. He didn't speak to anyone, didn't live in the village, didn't buy food. I didn't press for details. I didn't want any. I've never gone back to that area. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the flat at night, I think about the way that man moved. Slow, silent, watching. I think about how he'd circled my tent the first night, how he stood still for so long in the trees, how close he got without making a sound. And I think about how I almost stayed a third night. If I had, I don't think I'd have left the forest at all.